Hello and welcome everybody. I'm Anthony Gonzalez and I'm the Senior Program Coordinator with the Higher Education Center for Alcohol and Drug Misuse Prevention and Recovery. And I want to welcome you all today to our webinar titled Alcohol, Cannabis, and Team Success, Lessons from the Field, featuring Susie Bruce, Max Tankersley, and Lars Tiffany. Before we get started with today's content, I do just have a couple of housekeeping slides I'd like to share with everybody. Here on the screen should look somewhat familiar as we are in the Zoom webinar format. We do welcome your questions at any time throughout the live session for our presenters. We do just kindly ask that you utilize the Q&A feature. We also have the chat enabled, so feel free to introduce yourself as well as share reflections and resources as it relates for today's content. But we again kindly ask that you utilize the Q&A feature. We also have live captioning enabled for today's session, and you can turn that on through your bottom dashboard. If you have any issues getting that set up, please feel free to send me a message through the chat and I can help you through that process. We also encourage everybody to learn more about becoming a member of the Higher Education Center. You can learn more about the different membership tiers and the benefits that go along with them by visiting our website at hecaod.osu.edu. We also have a few upcoming events that I'd like to share with everybody. Our new prevention professional series titled Fundamentals of Substance Misuse Prevention in Higher Education is a series taking place starting next week, and it is facilitated by our very own Cindy Clowner and Logan Davis. Our next free webinar will be taking place later this month on November 20th and is titled Integrating Evidence-Based and Evidence-Informed Practices on Your Campus, Building Momentum and Addressing Potential Challenges. And we also have the 2024 Cannabis Symposium that we're excited about happening December 12th. The full agenda and information about registration can be found on our website. And with that, it is my great pleasure to turn it over to our presenters today. Joining us today are Susie Bruce, Director of the Gordy Center at the University of Virginia, Max Tankersley, Gordy Center Apple Training Institute and Student Athlete Mentor Program Manager at University of Virginia, and Coach Lars Tiffany, Men's Lacrosse Head Coach at University of Virginia. Thank you everybody for joining us, and it's my pleasure turning it over to you at this time.
Thank you so much. We're really excited to have been invited to speak with folks today. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get us in presenter mode. There we go. So again, thanks for taking the time to be with us. We're really excited to share some fun information with you. As we get started, we mentioned, I think in our titles, the Apple Training Institute. And so that was something that has been created at the University of Virginia. And since 1992, we have been leading national training institutes to help institutions and their athletic departments learn about our Apple model of substance misuse prevention that's unique to the athletics culture. There's a lot that's on our website, so you'll see pretty much on every slide, appleathletics.org, where you can find out more information. And if you're wondering what Apple stands for, it's Athlete Prevention Programming and Leadership Education. So it's really a very student-athlete centered model. And what you're going to see today is kind of 2 hours worth condensed into one that talks about alcohol, cannabis, and athletic performance and what that means for team success. A little bit about us. We have this Apple Training Institute. Our next one is for Division II schools only. That'll be in September of next year. That is by nomination through the Division II NCAA athletic conferences, and that'll open up about this time next month. So reach out to us if you're a Division II school and you're interested in knowing more. We do a lot of presentations like this. We have materials specific to student athletes as well as for general student populations, and a ton of free digital tools that are available for free, and we'll have more information about that at the very end of the presentation. So always want to give a shout out to where we're getting a lot of this information. You'll see a ton of citations on our slides. We have, if you look at the PDF that's part of this presentation, there's a million hyperlinks. We are all about making sure that we've got the information, but we want to make sure you get all of those original resources. So a lot of the citations are from these special issues of the Journal of Sport and Exercise Medicine. These were commissioned by the International Olympic Committee to really look at all of these issues around mental health, physical health, and elite athletes. And there are some great resources. One just came out this summer from the DEA and their campus drug prevention site. So it really talks about how do you, if you're a prevention specialist, how do you apply what you know around substance misuse to that athletics population? So there's a lot of great resources there. And then, of course, the NCAA has their substance abuse prevention intervention guide. So just a lot that we could spend hours talking about. But if this gets you interested in working more with your student athletes, these are really great references that we encourage you to consider. So we like to use something called Menti. You can do this on your phone. You can just open up another browser on your website. And all you do is go to menti.com, or obviously if you've got your phone, you can just go to this QR code. Anytime we have an interactive slide, you'll see at the very top right up here, menti.com and the code. So that's on every single slide. It is something you can join at any time. As some folks have already figured out, you can give a reaction slide and tell us thumbs up. This is really fun. Always love that. We always use it with our student populations. So we will use it throughout a few things. It is completely anonymous. It's not tracking your web browser. It's not getting your IP address or anything else. And we always have just one rule, which is truth or nothing. So we all want to hear what everyone else is thinking. If you guessed wrong on one of our little quiz questions, no one's going to know it was you. So just put in your best answer. We'll have one or maybe two sort of open-ended questions where you can type in some responses, so that may or may not be easier on your web browser, but you'll also see all of the slides, even if they're not interactive on your phone. So with that, and because you can continue to join in, I want to keep us on track with time. We're going to go to our next question. Again, if you weren't able to log in before, you can just go to menti.com. The code is at the top. You can answer more than one, because we know some of you have multiple identities. And you can add to the chat if one of your categories is not listed here. And this should be giving us an actual number, I think is how I said it, instead of just percentages. So very exciting. I'd heard from at least one school that they were going to have some student athletes on the call. So I'm really excited to see all of you that are student athletes. This is who we typically provide this presentation to. So, but this just helps us all know who's here, but also that we can frame some of the conversations around different populations. So again, a lot of you have gotten in. If you don't get in on this question, you can join at any time. If you skip a question, which I hope you won't, you can still join in. It's not if you skip a question, you can never join back in. So with that, it looks like we've got a lot of folks in health promotion and some folks that identify more or equally with student affairs. And I love that we've got a number of folks within athletics. So let's hop right in. So to start off, I'm going to do a little bit of our framing. Many of you that are health promotion folks are familiar with the socio-ecological model. Well, this is the version that the NCAA has adapted of this national model, and it really just focuses on here that for our student athlete population, we start off with what does the student athlete know? What's their environment? What are their choices? And then we move into the team. And so just really specifically mentioning that includes our coaches and athletic trainers. We work a lot with our athletic trainers because they see our student athletes when they're healthy, when they're not so healthy. A lot of times student athletes will share information in the training room that they maybe aren't planning on sharing. So they hear and see a lot, and they're really great allies in our work in prevention. So when we look at what's happening in the team, make sure any kind of outreach you're creating include your coaches and your trainers. So I wasn't sure when we first created this if we were going to have student athletes, but if we have an all athlete audience, we will always ask them, tell us of these various, goals, what are most important to you? And I bet you can guess that the two that are most important every time we've done this with schools at all kinds of different students at all kinds of different schools, they want to contribute to the team. They want to have a winning season. Those are by far the top. I will say, unfortunately, good grades isn't necessarily the top one every time. But these are what are motivating our student athletes. They are competitive. They want to do well. And just like all of us, we want to have meaning in our lives. And so when you see some of these slides, really we put this together from sort of a motivational interviewing perspective. What is the hook? What is going to help someone have healthier behaviors versus unhealthy behaviors? And that's what you're going to see throughout this, how we can take this information to help people make choices in their own lives and also reach out to the team where they're improving their ability to contribute and potentially have a winning season. Because really it all boils down to, how do you be a good teammate? So this is not an abstinence program. We are going to talk about, for student athletes, there probably are greater risks when folks are using, but it's really about, regardless of what my choice is, how do I be a good teammate? How can I share this kind of information with understanding, with compassion, knowing for the most part, we're all here trying to win, trying to contribute to our teams. So I'm going to kick it off before I hand it over to Max, and I'm going to start with what we know about student athletes' substance use. These data come from the most recent NCAA Student Athlete Health and Wellness Study. There's a hyperlink there. There is so much information about this study online. If you want to know what men's lacrosse players at Division III or women's lacrosse players or softball players, my son actually is a Division II lacrosse player, so that hits in my head a lot. I use lacrosse as an example. We'll say women's softball at Division II, you can actually see for different substances what those rates are. And that's not to shame or blame anybody. That is really so if you're an administrator, you can look at that data in case you don't have it for your campus and say, well, it looks like here are some problem areas. Here are some areas of teams that tend to have low risk use. How can we find out what's going right with these teams? And how can we support and identify these teams that are maybe struggling a little bit more? So as you can see here, this survey is sent every 4 years to all NCAA member schools. Out of each campus, between 1 and 3 schools are surveyed. The FAR is the faculty athletic representative. So this is not coaches in the room. This is a faculty member administering this survey so that we feel like there's confidentiality and student athletes will be honest. You can see all the other data there. And again, there's tons of information online. The last time we had data was 2017, since we were supposed to be collecting during the pandemic, and that got delayed a little bit. So first Mentimeter quiz question, what % of student athletes do you think, and this is across all 3 divisions in this most recent survey that was 2023, what % of student athletes drink in healthier ways? In other words, less than 4 drinks for females, 5 drinks for males per occasion. So like in a setting, and this is what typically folks would identify as a binge drinking, but this is the wording from the survey. So I'll give y'all a couple seconds to click in. So y'all are thinking, so far the majority of you are saying about 46% of students are drinking in healthier ways. Therefore, 54%, the majority are actually drinking in unhealthy ways. They're drinking above that minimum, but actually 66%. And don't feel bad, because every time we present this data, people think it's much lower. So here's where we put in some social norms, right? So student athletes are making healthier choices. And this is, over time. So from the past decade or so, student athletes are following the national norms. Fewer students are drinking heavily, drinking in ways that potentially harm themselves or others. So this is some great data to share. And again, if you've got this kind of data on your campus, we know that student athletes want to see data from other student athletes. So if you've got campus-wide norms, that might be great, but understand what that's like. And I will say, working on a Division I campus, when we have asked our student athletes, they want to see Division I NCAA data. And again, you can get that from that website. There's a whole bunch of research available. So you can look at Division II, Division III, what are those norms? And also find out, is that what's relevant on your campus? And then you've got some data that you can share. A few more, we're all aware that vaping has gone up dramatically. We weren't even asking it before 2017. So the nicotine data is kind of all over, mostly a decline, although here cigarette use is pretty stable. We're not seeing a big change in the past 10 years. And really vaping is what we're seeing pretty dramatically. So we looked at ethnicity. And I have the population with the healthiest behaviors at the top. So students who identify in that survey as Black or African American are the least likely to use alcohol, less than half. And this is in the past year. They are the second less likely. Hispanic students, 23% of them used, and they used marijuana in the survey. So I'm using that same language since that's what students were asked instead of cannabis. And they're the least likely here to use vape or to use e-cigarettes. So it's important for us to also look at what our populations are on our campuses and maybe not make assumptions about who is using and who is not. And really, again, focus on those healthy norms and how can we grow those healthy norms. We don't have data specifically on students who attend HBCUs that are also athletes. So the data we could find really compares national colleges and universities to HBCUs. And again, we can see much healthier behaviors. How many drinks per occasion, as well as how many days per month. So less frequency, less quantity. So there's really protective factors among students at HBCUs. So what about hazing? Because we know that there's a lot of alcohol involved in hazing. What percent of student athletes have experienced at least one form of hazing in college? And this is from the national study Hazing in View that Dr. Elizabeth Allen, the University of Maine, conducted. And as part of that, asked students about a variety of experiences and then which the groups those were related to. So, all right, we're going to go ahead and look because most people think, right, fraternities and sororities, that's the most hazing. We know that's really high. It's 74%. 3/4 of our student athletes have experienced hazing. So that is right on a par with fraternities and sororities. Nationally, that's 73%. So 3/4 of our student athletes experience hazing on an athletic team. This may have also included club sports, but a lot of this information in this presentation is also club sports that travel to compete have a lot of similarities with your varsity athletics. And we can see almost half had to play drinking games, a quarter drinking to the point, of getting sick. And startlingly, a quarter thought my coach or my advisor was aware. This does not mean the coach was aware, but if you think about how much of an athlete's life is guided by the coach. My son's team, practice on Saturday starts at 8 a.m. If you are not there at 7:45, you are late and everyone is going to do a few more laps. So coaches know everything that's going on. So it makes sense that coaches, that student athletes believe if hazing's happening, my coach is at least aware that it's happening. So our message to coaches is always, you need to talk about these behaviors and you need to talk about them pretty frequently. I've shared some of the not so good data. I want to make sure we also know, again, we said this is about being a good teammate. Student athletes in that same survey were asked about sort of some bystander behaviors. And you can see student athletes on men's teams in red, women's teams on green. And student athletes are looking out for people. This was specific around teammates. So again, some really great bystander intervention messages that we can get. If you don't have that data on your campus, look to those NCAA data. You can look at each division to see what's representative, perhaps, of your student population. But these are really some really good positive norms here. So I sped through a lot of that. And I am now going to turn over to Max, who's going to talk about alcohol and athletic performance.
Thanks, Susie. Yeah, so just to kind of preview this right here, we're going to get into a lot of different studies and a lot of different data. I am going to move fast so we can get to our last section, but a lot of these resources, all these resources are linked or sourced there. So I encourage you, if something grabs your attention, go into that PDF, pull up that information for yourself. And as we get into this data, I think Susie's given you a lot of the information on norms and really that idea of like, what is the hook when we talk with student athletes about these issues? And I think now we're getting into that hook in these slides, particularly when we talk about having a winning, successful season, talking about how alcohol and other substances can impact that winning. So, question for you all, this is open-ended. What are the ways that alcohol use can impact a team? Can divide people. Yeah, absolutely. I think particularly when you think about if there's a group of students, athletes on a team who are going dry or are sober, it can definitely pull people apart. I see morale as well. Performance. We're going to talk a lot about performance here. Waste the next day. We're going to talk a lot about next day and maybe even next several day impacts for sure. Culture, absolutely. Really important part of that experience. Poor sleep. We're going to talk about sleep, performance. You all are hitting on so many of the important things here. So let's get right into it. Uh, Looking first here at aerobic performance, we know that alcohol use decreases blood flow to muscles and organs, and it drains energy available for muscles to perform. And I think that bullet point is going to repeat and repeat as we go through all the different body systems that are involved here, is that energy is not available after drinking. This is a statistic that I find really concerning. It's at least 22%. So 1 in 5 athletes show up to practice with low energy availability. And there's variation by sport, and not all of that is due to alcohol use. But if we already have this issue of 1 in 5 student athletes showing up to practice with not enough energy to perform at their best, adding alcohol on top of whatever other drains on student athlete energy there are clearly is a big issue and is something we want to be talking about student athletes with. So within that 1 in 5, we know those who are drinking, their body is spending energy metabolizing that alcohol, right? It needs to be processed. And it's not making more glucose, which you need to compete and recover. It goes into so many of those body systems. And we know that having that glucose deficiency can lead to severe hypoglycemia after heavy drinking. So another quiz question for you all. What do you think? Within 4 hours of drinking, dehydration can cause what % loss of body weight? Looks like we're skewing on the higher end here. All right, we're mostly on 2%, so let's look at it. So we're working with a 1, 2, 3, 4 equation here. So dehydration of 1 to 2% in body mass reduces the capacity of muscles. Water loss of 3% results in diminished athletic performance, and up to 3% body weight loss within 4 hours of drinking occurs. So particularly, I think it's so important for so many of our student athletes, the muscle they're trying to put on all the time, particularly in preseason, that they're training their bodies to be ready for performance. They can lose up to 3% of that body weight just 4 hours after drinking. We also know that drinks containing as little as 4% alcohol result in delay of recovery due to urine loss. So even, if you're thinking that, oh, well, a lower percentage is going to help me here, even that lower 4% is still leading to really, really big detriments to athletic performance and success. We also know alcohol dehydrates, which I think is pretty common knowledge, but the longer term and those deeper effects are really important to understand as well. Heat cramps and exhaustion, the risk goes way up when alcohol is involved. Temperature tolerance goes way down. I know when I talk with our teams here at UVA who spend all summer training in the heat to really get that heat acclimation up, that really is an important investment in their season, right? You put a lot into that. Alcohol takes that right away and actually reverses heat acclimation training. So they can do all that training, drink, and then lose that strength and that heat acclimation that they've built up. We also know alcohol impairs motor skills. And this is for up to 3 days. I think we're going to get into a little bit this myth of like, well, it's just the day after that you have impacts. 3 days after, you still have decreases in lower body output. So 72 hours later there. I know this one, particularly when we're talking with athletes who are really focused on bulking up, putting on a lot of muscle, this is the one that catches their attention. 70% decrease in human growth hormone secretion after drinking, which is a really severe decrease. So, and they're getting back in the gym after all of this, trying to lift, trying to put on that muscle, even if they're working just as hard or twice as hard, they've lost all that HGH secretion. We also know that reaction time can be affected up to 11 hours after drinking. So all that quick twitch muscle and mental game in those motor skills that we try to keep up, that's a skill that can really be impacted by alcohol. Sleep as well. This was brought up earlier, and I think, being well rested and being recovered from injury is an obvious thing we don't want to lose, particularly when it comes to alcohol. But we also talk a lot with teams about game plans, right? There's a lot of studying, a lot of mental focus, a lot of learning the game for so many of our athletes. And when that information and learning and game plan is getting filed away, in sleep and keeping their energy up, that's all interrupted, right? We see here it's memory formation and muscle repair all over. So both the physical, but also the mental game can really be interrupted by that alcohol impact on sleep. This is another one that I think is a real important hook for athletes. We know that alcohol has the potential to double the risk of injury. This study cited here was a group of rugby players. And for the non-drinkers, about a quarter of them were getting injured over the course of a season, and more than half were injured by the end of the season. So really looking at that long-term impact of, athletes want so badly to be on the field, to be winning, to be contributing to the team. We saw that early. And, taking yourself off the field or increasing your risk of being taken off the field for something like this is a really important hook and an important conversation to be having. We also know it slows recovery. I think one of the populations with student athletes that we find important to do outreach to is folks who are injured and who aren't competing every weekend, and maybe, are tempted to make different choices over the course of their season. And we know that even if you're not competing, alcohol is going to have an impact on your performance in your recovery. Particularly drinking after exercise. We know it increases exercise-induced muscle damage, which decreases performance. We really don't want to be upping that damage, obviously, on anyone who's recovering from an injury. All right, another quiz for you. Recovery can be delayed if an athlete drinks fewer than how many hours after competition? And there's a conversation we often have about teams, celebrating after a win. Like it's a significant cultural thing that we see on teams that we want to talk about that direct impact of. That was just fun. We're kind of split between the extremes, but most of us think it's 4 hours here. 16. It's 16 whole hours after. So, and I think the example that's helpful to think about there is, if there's a Saturday competition, team wins a big game, they go out and celebrate that evening, there's alcohol involved, their performance is impacted all the way until the end of Sunday into Monday. Right. So really like giving that time frame, giving this information of all that muscle repair and, sleep and all the other things we've mentioned, that's all going to be impacted by a celebration involving alcohol or alcohol use for any other reason after competition, and really honing in on that important time for recovery after pushing hard and competing. So question for you all, we're going to start to move into cannabis now. We've covered most of the alcohol content. How often do you think the typical NCAA student athlete uses cannabis? All right, we've got a pretty significant majority on monthly there. And actually, it's the vast majority don't use. It's 77% answered on this survey. They've never used or used more than a year ago. And some of the trends we want to look at within that, this is data from 2017 and 2023. The prevalence of inhalants, pretty much the same statistically, the same right there. There's an increase in ingestibles, so edibles, oils, tinctures. But the really important one we want to hone in on is this 10-time increase in synthetic marijuana use, particularly because the concentration of those synthetics is a lot harder to judge. So this is a trend that we're following, and we're going to get into the effects and also some NCAA kind of best practices and where folks are moving on that, because I think we all know there's been a lot of policy change around that recently. So talking first about effects, I think there is sometimes a myth that, cannabis is a alternative to alcohol because it impacts you less. I think the fact that there's not a hangover in the way that we treat it with alcohol is sometimes tempting for folks to use as an alternative. And we actually know the cannabis effects last several days. That is a myth. It does stick with you. And I mean, you see the list here, the respiratory system, your heart, your cognition, psychomotor. It's impacting every part of the body, all those things we were listing earlier that are so important for athletic performance and success on the field, the pool, the court, whatever it is. Those effects do stick around. I think it's important to see how many areas of the body it touches into there. So diving into cardiovascular, I think heart health is on the mind of most athletes in a really important way. Resting heart rate goes up for cannabis users. We've seen even a 20 to 100% increase from one joint. So even, one use really increases that resting heart rate. Blood pressure is high. The work capacity of the body goes down. Stamina gets hurt. Again, we were talking about heat acclimation. All of that strength that athletes spend all year long trying to build up can really get taken down by this stuff. And endurance as well. And again, at the end here, it also affects the body's ability to regulate blood temperature. So all these really important impacts on things that student athletes are already thinking about and really want their bodies to be able to do well at a really high level. Looking also at skill impairment, we were looking at all those motor skills earlier. That can last up to 36 hours. So that is a long period of time to have a prolonged effect from just one use. So again, looking at reflexes, balance, that increased risk of injury pops up again. There's an increased time needed to learn and memorize when we talk about those game plans and the mental side of the game. There's definitely a detriment there. There's reduced attention, concentration, decision-making ability. All these important both mental and physical skills, really do have a long-term effect from cannabis use. So here's one of the most important questions we want to talk about. Cannabis improves sleep. How much do you agree or disagree on this statement? Oh, we were right in the middle, and now we're okay. So we have answers all over the place. We have a lot of people on that strongly disagree front, and we want to be really honest with you and really honest in our conversations with student athletes about this, which is that yes, over short periods of time, cannabis does actually make it easier for folks with sleep problems, but the long-term effects are actually moving in the other direction. It can harm sleep patterns. So the way that works is folks in the short term receive a benefit, but then there's a tolerance issue where folks end up needing to use more and more. And quitting involves sleep difficulties, even among those who were using low doses in the first place. So even if there are short-term benefits, in the long term, it actually does more harm to sleep habits and quality. And those withdrawal symptoms can begin the first day of abstinence and last up to 6 weeks. So really, you get a dependence there. Yes, and I just saw a comment in the chat about it might help with falling asleep, but it does not boost quality of sleep. You see this last bullet point at the end here. You get an increase in deep sleep, which is stage 4, but you get a decrease in REM sleep, which is where dreaming happens. If you've ever heard somebody who is using cannabis say, "Oh, I just don't dream anymore," that is, a scientific impact of it. That deepest. I wish it was called deepest sleep because it is stage 5. It's that 5th stage there. It's more than deep, and it's where a lot of the important memory and processing and deep sleep impacts happen. So I'm not going to be able to share everything from this resource with you, but I encourage you all, if you want to dive into this more, there are links in the PDF to multiple of these Sports Science Institute Spotlight webinars where they really dive in this style of webinar on this particular issue. They've got a couple of medical experts in there talking on broad, social norms and motivational interviewing, and how do we approach users and specifically student athletes on these issues. But the really important takeaway we want you to take from these is that these experts are saying there's not strong evidence that cannabis is an effective treatment for pain in humans. A lot of the science on cannabis is really new, and a lot of what you hear about a lot of these, oh, well, it might benefit this, it might benefit that, is that we really don't know yet. The science is so new, and particularly when we're talking about synthetic cannabinoids, that's a whole new world of really intense concentration that kind of blows the old concentration out of the water and makes old science on this stuff not quite as applicable. But I think an important thing to see here, because in addition to sleep, pain treatment is one of the topics we hear cannabis use on for student athletes the most. And I think important to note that there is not scientific evidence right now for that to be used in humans. We also know that it does have these detrimental effects. It does function as a performance impairing agent. Decreased exercise performance, which we saw earlier, those increases in heart rate and increases in blood pressure. Those are the things that our student athletes are training so hard to get their bodies to have higher and higher tolerance and energy for. And they really don't want to have things in their lives that are pushing those things in the other direction. And so before we wrap up on cannabis, there's a lot of text on this screen worth investigating further if this is of interest to you. But when we're looking at these consensus foundational statements from the NCAA's Summit on Cannabis Use, we know there's been this very recent policy change from them. But we'd see number one, the statement here is that cannabinoids do not enhance athletic performance, which was part of the decision to make it no longer an NCAA banned substance, but also important to talk to student athletes who may have conceptions of it as boosting their performance or well-being in one way or another, to really share this information about the detrimental effects to athletic performance as well.
Great.
And I'm going to turn it back over to Susie.
Thanks so much. And I saw there's some questions in the chat and in the Q&A, and I saw one about anxiety, and we did have to cut down a lot. But there's certainly research about anxiety and cannabis, and some people will use it as a treatment for anxiety, but it actually is more likely to produce anxiety. And we know that folks who have a family history, that there are definitely, it can uncover some mental health illnesses that have a genetic component at a younger age and can increase severity. So we've got some of that on our website, but thank you for those questions. And we're going to move along to make sure that we get through all of our content. And some folks I may need to, there's a question about temperature regulation. You may need to dig back into the articles and get back to you on an answer on that. What's the mechanism, the question. So I'm going to pull all this together. And this is part of what we shared with our UVA men's athletic team. And when I first met with Coach Tiffany, some of this information, because we know that hangover is one of the most frequent negative consequences of drinking among college students. And so for an athlete, what's the problem with the hangover other than just like feeling pretty crummy and not wanting to go out to practice or, a competition? So here are really some of those specific things, sort of blending in what Max just talked about. And also weakened immune system. We know people who drink heavily are more likely to get sick. We talked about sleep already, but all of these things together are also part of the effects of a hangover. We've talked a lot about dehydration. That's one of the biggest effects of overuse of alcohol. So what does that really mean? So let's just look at getting drunk one time. Athletes put a ton of time and hours and effort in the weight room and training and doing so much work. And again, as the parent of a college athlete, I mean, his whole summer he was working so hard to make sure that he was ready for the college game. He knew it was going to be a huge increase for him. So what is just that effect of getting drunk one time? So y'all are saying probably about 5 days, but the reality is, let me get the cursor in the right spot. It's 14, which I will tell you, whenever we do this with a live audience, you can hear a gasp from all the student athletes. Like, what? I don't believe you on that. So this research really looks at the physiological conditioning. So what it's doing to your heart rate, your lung capacity, the enzymes that are helping repair your muscles. And what we know is, here's a direct quote, that body mass loss of 1 to 2%. We saw that in all of the dehydration pieces. We know hangovers, dehydration, that's a really common side effect. That compromises the physical performance. And it's a lot around cardiovascular. So is it suddenly someone's muscles are going to like shrink overnight? No. But when we look at those tiny margins, what we'll tell our athletes across all divisions, you're typically, your conference, you could have probably gotten recruited to any of those schools, right? You're probably pretty evenly matched. So it really is what team shows up for the competition that day. And this is one of those pieces. Again, we are not an abstinence-based, but here's those tiny margins that might help you swim a little bit faster, help you have a little more gas in the tank if you're in overtime. And this is just parts of those puzzle pieces. Okay, we talked about hangovers. So for college student athletes, what percent can a hangover reduce your athletic performance? So if we were looking at like 100, you know, everyone's coaches are like, I want you to give 110%. We know that's not a thing. What percent, you know, are you not performing at your 100%? What's that deficit? Now we have primed you all through this program to think that it's like really significant. I will say, now the good news is it is not 40%. It's about 15 to 20%. So let's break that down a little bit. So this was research that was done with elite athletes like national team, Olympians. And they did all of this physiological testing. And then they got them drunk. And then they looked at what they were like the next day. And what they found for Olympic, you know, elite athletes was on average 11.5% off of their peak performance. And what they estimated for typical college students would be about a 15 to 20% deficit. And again, because students, I love presenting to students because they ask all these whys, and I'm like, let me go back and add that into my next presentation. And this is really what the research says. Why is it a 15 to 20% reduction? Again, what's your lung capacity? What's your heart capacity? And again, recovery. We know a serious workout, you're doing some muscle damage. A lot of this is about how can I get my muscles back in shape as quickly as possible. So I already mentioned 100%, 110% isn't a thing. If we say 90% is probably where a lot of people would think, all right, that's about that 11.4. That's the Olympians, right? 90% on most days average. A lot of people would say that's pretty good, right? But if we're saying just because of the impact of drinking that somebody might only be at 80%, I don't know that coaches are going to be happy with that. And again, going back to that first slide, what's important to you? What do you want for the year? You want to contribute to the team. You want to have a winning season. That's going to be tough if I'm only at 80% and if my team is only at 80%. So then we flip it and we ask student athletes, we ask teams, what would a 15% increase look like for you? What would it look like for your team? And again, what's that motivation? So here's our story as I lead into talking with Coach Tiffany. When I first started working with him in 2018, you know, and he wanted to look at the role of alcohol on the team. And I'll let him share a little bit more about that. But these are the stats we pulled. This is what we shared with the coach. This is what we shared with the team leaders and said, here's, you know, what the 2018 season was like. We're getting ready to roll into the 2019 season. This is in September of 2018. We just calculated, here's a 15% increase. Here's, if you start looking at alcohol use, here's what you might get. And Coach Tiffany will tell you all of the details of what we looked at because, you know, we looked at a lot around things. We went back and forth, a lot of iterations, but we were really excited that they won the national championship, which is why Coach Tiffany is here with us today. And when we calculated, I swear, we calculated this like 3 or 4 times because I'm like, there is no way there was a 40% increase. And we were just saying you might get 15, but these are the numbers. And then they did it again. No championship in 2020 due to the pandemic, but now you'll see they'd already been addressing alcohol on the team for 2 years. So, but they still had a 20% increase over their 2018 data. So with that, to share a little bit about this process, because it's one thing to say, oh, we shared some data and you're like, everything was magical and wonderful. It was a little more complicated than that, but I'm really pleased to introduce, and we're going to do this kind of as a little Q&A, a little podcast interview with Lars Tiffany, the head coach of the University of Virginia men's lacrosse and 2-time national championship coach and 2-time ACC coach of the year. So I'm going to get out of these slides and let me stop sharing so you can see us. So thanks so much, Coach Lars Tiffany. I'm just going to start off with, for folks who aren't familiar with lacrosse, tell us a little bit about the college culture.
First of all, well done, Susie. Well done, Max. It's great to be a part of this, and I appreciate everyone who's joined us. So fundamentally, I know Susie said why I'm here is because I won 2 national championships, but no, the real reason I'm here is because we were part of the problem. When I arrived to Charlottesville in 2016, I inherited a team that had talent, yet was making a lot of bad decisions socially, not just Saturday nights, Tuesday nights, you name the night, we were making bad decisions. Our first year, we didn't act right away. It was interesting. Bronco Mendenhall, new football coach, he came in swinging. I came in assessing, learning. I come from an Ivy institution. I wanted to learn Power Five conference athletics. And so it wasn't until after year one, I said, okay, we need to make some changes. But it really wasn't until after year two that we addressed consumption of alcohol and underage drinking. We had some bigger issues when I arrived. We had, we certainly had marijuana, we had cocaine, we had mushrooms. And so it wasn't until between 2018 and 2019, the data that Susie shared with you, when we recognized, okay, can we really take a step forward with success and those margins that Susie was talking about? That's when that's when we really attacked this culture. And that's where I'm very lucky to have the Gordy Center right here in Charlottesville. And I'm also very lucky to have the Apple Conference to be able to participate in that. But really what it came down to is the collaboration with the men, with the student athletes. And that's ultimately what this all comes down to, right? We can say we've got these lofty goals and objectives, but those temptations, the lures, they're out there. And so finding the right people and creating that dedication is absolutely critical. So as Susie's starting to ask me questions about culture, the culture is nothing if it's just me. It has to be the buy-in. And there's 2 steps. Getting the men you inherit, the parts of the puzzle, the women if it's a women's program, to buy in. Not all will. We got rid of 6 or 7 men. And then the talent acquisition process, aka recruiting. And in that process, communicating clearly that I will hold you to a higher standard than any other college lacrosse coach will. Yeah, maybe not Annapolis and West Point, but outside of them, we are going to hold you to a higher standard. And that's just it, because we have higher goals. We are aiming higher than everyone else. And that's what you accept when you join us.
So tell us, you started to talk about the in getting the buy-in. So let's look at that because there were a lot of bumps in the road. So tell us how you did get the team, that 2019, that first championship team, to embrace that change. How did you get the buy-in?
We've all heard the expression, it's going to get worse before it gets better. I always thought that was a good expression for losers to say. But I now have a real life example where that's actually a positive. And here's my scenario. What if in my first year, along with Kip Turner and Sean Kerwin, we'd come in and had instant success? It would have allowed the team, the men, to say, I knew we just need a new coach. They can continue their behaviors, their decision making. Instead, we barely are better. I inherit a 7-8 team that goes 8-7 after year one. So we're not magical coaches. And okay, what variable changed and what variable stayed the same? And the record stayed the same, essentially. It gave us an opportunity. And that's part where the beginning of the buy-in began. There were further mistakes. We weren't year two. We went 12-6. We made the NCAA tournament, lost in the first round. But you could start, the light bulb was coming on. We started having these cultural meetings with books. We started a book club. But it was really about the decision making that they were making when they were off the field. And that's really where they started saying, okay, we're making success because we've started making some changes. What if we continue to make additional changes? And to be honest with you, we're really talking about alcohol here because we got rid of the guys who were doing the drugs if we knew about it. And this was the hardest one, underage drinking, even of age drinking, overconsumption. This was the hardest one. And this is where the Gordy Center was invaluable to our success.
Well, thank you for that. I know you went through several iterations. In working with the team, they started off with like, well, we won't drink on Sundays. And we were kind of like, okay, when they were like looking at how they were going to moderate their alcohol use. And then I think you said you tried maybe an experiment about no drinking for a month. And how that really kind of, I guess that piece as well. Like, would you talk about how that was a little bit different from you. I think you were getting pressure to be like, this has to be no drinking on the team, and how you kind of navigated that as well. It's kind of maybe speaking to other coaches that are watching this.
Sure, 100 conversations with my captains. We formed a SABR committee, which is the three captains plus two representatives of the freshman, sophomore, and junior classes, getting more feedback, getting ideas, exchanging thoughts. What do we try here? Coach, if you say no alcohol, we're all just going to break that rule. Okay, I get it. Like if I say, here's a speed limit, you're gonna go faster than the speed limit. But if we all decide, if we agree to do this, to not go over the speed limit, then maybe most of us won't go over the speed limit. And so it was the collaboration of buy-in. And again, what it really came down to was I was lucky in many ways. One of the lucky things is I arrived in Charlottesville and there was talent here. They were just awash in alcohol and drugs getting in the way. What if I'd gotten down here and they were a bunch of teetotaling, church attending every Sunday morning, looking sharp, and no talent? That's why they weren't good. I'd be like, we weren't winning a national championship in 3 years. And so they were talented lacrosse players and they craved success and they got some and then they got a little bit more. Well, how do we take the next step? Well, there's these margins. There's these opportunities to reduce the injuries, the slides you just saw, increase athletic performance. And you can't deny it, fellas. You can't deny it. There was also the buy-in too was committing towards, reducing the amount of alcohol. And then as you alluded to, during the 2019 spring, not the entire spring, but as we get closer to playoff time, are we going to do this? Are we doing this? And they all looked at each other and it was up to them. It wasn't to me. I wasn't going to be the up here telling them top down and they ignore it and they blast through the speed limits. They said, we're not going to drink the rest of the year. That's it. We're going to give this a chance. We're going to give it a shot. And some were mad. Some were not happy about this. They gave it a chance. And that's the second time I got lucky because then all of a sudden, these overtime games, we had 5 of them in 2019. We won every single one of them. I still don't think I have a 500 record in overtime in my overall career, but in 2019 we were 5-0. And you got to see the margins in reality. You got to see it at play. Like sure, we can blame the bounce of a ball or hitting a pipe, but come on, a little bit of extra effort, a little bit of energy, picking up that loose ball and getting an extra possession. Um, so where we were fortunate, they got to see it. And you don't always see it right away, right? We don't deal in 1/100th of a second like maybe Olympic runners and swimmers do. Most of us don't see it. We were lucky that we got to see it.
Yeah, and kind of going to what you mentioned before, it actually was that decision to stop drinking was after a loss. So
That's
they
right.
lost, and then after that is when they kind of made that decision. And I've shared with Coach, to be honest, I'll share with this audience that 2 seasons ago, end of April, which is the end of the season before NCAA postseason plays in May, I'm listening on TV and I hear reporters saying, oh, this UVA team, they don't drink in the month of May. And I'm like, wow, what a change in like 4 seasons. So how that's actually gotten out in the community as well. And I think perhaps has a ripple effect among other programs. You talk about pressure is a privilege. And we know that a lot of student athletes say they drink to manage the pressure. Can you talk about how you help the team think about turning pressure into a good thing?
Sure. And I'm not saying I've got all the answers here, but when I heard that quote, pressure is a privilege, I wanted to try to flip its story on its head and look at it as a positive thing. Those nerves you're feeling, you know, most of them are internal, and those nerves might be there if there's 10 people in the stands instead of 10,000. But that extra pressure you might feel from the media, from the press, from family members texting, good luck here in the Final Four game, where there's 30,000 people in the stands. That's a privilege. That's a wonderful thing to have, that what you do, other people care about. This is an incredible opportunity. It doesn't maybe put the anxiety and the nerves and all that away, but we'd say, man, that's people would give, this is the fountain of youth. This is the drug that we should be all taking. That if you could give someone pre-game anxiety jitters, you are alive. You are more alive than ever right now, because you've committed so much. And this is what it comes down to, sacrifice. I always imagine like there's this middle of the country family watching TV and an ESPN. They say, oh, Virginia men's lacrosse isn't drinking in the month of May. And they're like, well, of course they shouldn't be. Aren't they trying to win a national championship? But we all know when you're 20 or 21 years old, there's a lot of things you like to do outside of sports in your classes. There's a fraternity party, sorority party. There's a cute girl inviting you to a party. there's all these other things pulling on you. And so when you say sacrifice for the rest of us, like that's not a big sacrifice, but when you're in a situation, it seems like a big sacrifice. And so when you make that sacrifice, when you commit to the rest of your teammates, you're getting to the attention to details, aren't you? You're committing yourself to something, a higher cause. And most of us want that. And we really do. We crave that. We want our independence again, but we do really want to be a part of a greater, bigger cause. And so that's the challenge we put to our men, and our men lead this and guide this if we do the right job in developing our leadership.
You talked a little bit at the beginning about how you recruit and onboard new student athletes. So, kind of what that means to play lacrosse at UVA and how you're really upfront about what this culture is and what's acceptable and what's not. Could you talk for a moment about that process as you're recruiting students and also once they're here, how they're onboarding? And I may share a picture of one of the move-in day.
And I want to admit to the viewers, this is not intrinsically who I am. I was the head coach of Brown University, a very uber liberal school in the Northeast, and I actually graduated from there as well. So I'm a product of, find yourself, find your own way, laissez-faire. I arrived in Charlottesville, much more of a fishbowl, a bigger deal ACC market. And then I recognized I needed to make changes or we were going to continue to be a bad program. So I had to change. So I just wanted to make sure I wanted to put that out there. The opportunity to get the right people on the bus is absolutely critical. The talent acquisition process, as I was mentioning. And so I'm not afraid to do it. Now, you could say, well, coach, you're UVA. What if I'm at Southwest Alaska State? I may not be able to be really, really tough in that recruiting meeting when they're in my office, and I might be pushing good players away when I need every good player I can. Good point. I get it. I get it. But I still think in the long run, you're going to get the right guys, the right players, the right women on your bus. If you let them know this is our vision. And to get there, I'm going to ask a tremendous amount of you, more than any other college lacrosse coach will. Have we lost some recruits because of it? I'm sure. There's definitely been 4 or 5 times in my 6 or 7 years since we started doing this, really aggressive recruiting process. How did we lose that guy? We ask 100 other questions. Well, maybe should have done the home visit a little longer, a little sooner, but well, maybe you didn't like the message, Lars. You kind of scare some people away sometimes. You're like, yeah, maybe that was it too. So it's not for everyone.
Yeah. And we actually, I'm going to share screen for just a moment here because on move-in day, which I think a lot of schools may not do, is we have a program for men here. Hold on if I can get this. Hopefully it's sharing. So you see, here's all the parents. Here's all the men up front. We do bartender school with water, teaching them like some alcohol basics. And I think that says a lot. They all know it. We have a little dinner afterwards, but I think that helps set the stage that this is important. And it says it to the parents as well. And I think in our last moment or two, anything else around the strategies and particularly that the men developed to create a positive team culture and things that might work on other campuses as well.
I love our book club. It's do they all read the book over the summer or over the winter break? Probably not. But we give them about 3 days heads up before we're going to talk about it that upcoming Thursday or Friday. Hey, make sure you read chapter 8. Probably the first time for some of them. And it just gets us to go through and talk about those issues. And no matter what group you are, you're going to bring it back to your group. Whether reading 11 Rings by Phil Jackson, or we're reading Legacy by James Kerr or The Boys in a Boat. It's the book club has been absolutely fantastic. The other thing, we spend all summer developing our captains and leadership. Do not wait until the school year or the following year so the freshmen have a vote. I used to think that way. Make your vote, get it done, all right, and then spend the whole summer or whatever your off season is and developing that captaincy and that leadership, because the onboarding process is the most critical time for any company or organization. You all know this, but that first day, that first week, the first month, we want to make sure that we've created a program where our men are being guided towards the field and the weight room and not the keg party.
Anything else that I haven't asked you that you haven't had a chance to sort of share about especially alcohol and culture on your team?
No, I mean, it's obvious, and we have all the data now and these wonderful resources, and these people consistently remind us of the detriments of overconsumption of alcohol, the use of drugs, hazing, and all this. And I'm just very lucky to I give a real life example of when you have great resources and you listen to them of what the result can be.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I'm gonna, we have like a moment left here, and I'm gonna share the screen for just a couple of closing slides. This one is actually, we had the entire team at our Apple Training Institute this past January, since we're here in Charlottesville, and Coach actually had the entire team come in a day early, and practice started the next day. Here's our, we actually had a group from our team with many of the captains who created a plan around their student athlete mentors for the team. I'm just going to end here really quickly with, again, some of the free tools that we have that you're available. You know, you can use any of these things. This is in the slide deck. There's free videos. So there's one about hazing prevention. There's a video we have that has really brief some of this alcohol information that we just shared. Lots and lots of Instagram and other things. We have about 15, I think, videos here that you can share. And there's one here. I'm not going to share it in the interest of time, but how alcohol use might be keeping you and your team from reaching your goals. So with that, I don't know if we have any wrap up from the Higher Ed Center, but again, thank you, Coach, for being here. I'm really grateful for the partnership. And I will say also, these kind of messages really make an impact. Coach Tiffany knows this, my son as a first year athlete, many conversations with coaches around the country would say, well, you know, UVA lacrosse, they practice on Sunday. They don't take Sunday off. That, you know, controls a little bit of what happens on Saturday, and it makes an impact. So we're happy to talk with anybody after this webinar, but I'm going to turn it back over to Anthony.
Well, thank you so much, Susie, Coach Tiffany, and Max. Thank you so much for sharing of yourself and your expertise. And be sure to check the chat of seeing all the kind words and appreciation being shared from the presentation. I do just have a couple of housekeeping slides I'd like to share with everybody before we conclude. We have just a few upcoming events that I would like to share. Our new prevention professional training series taking place November 14th, 15th, and the 22nd of this month. Will be featuring our very own Cindy Clowner and Logan Davis. Our next free webinar will be taking place in just a few weeks on November 20th and is titled Integrating Evidence-Based and Evidence-Informed Practices on Your Campus, Building Momentum and Addressing Potential Challenges. And we also have the 2024 Cannabis Symposium scheduled for December 12th. And we have the full agenda published online, and you can learn more about registration by visiting our website. Just a friendly reminder that today's session has been recorded, so you can expect to see the session recording uploaded to our website within 3 business days. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we hope to see you at a future event. Take care, all.
I know it's great to see so many Apple School